In the lesson today, we'll review chapters 11 to 21. The lesson focus today is actually on chapter 22. God made the covenant with Abraham to give the Israelites the promised land almost 700 years prior to Joshua leading them into the land. Moses had died, and Joshua was following God's explicit instructions on how to conquer the land. It had been given to the Israelites in an everlasting covenant, but they had to fight the inhabitants of the land to gain control of it. In chapters 10 through 12, the scripture recounts all the victories of the Israelites in taking the land. In all, 31 kings were defeated at this point. In chapter 13, God is telling Joshua all the lands that still need to be taken. God promises Joshua they would defeat the people in the land. Joshua is old at this point. God tells him exactly how the yet-to-be-conquered land should be divided among the Israelites. Don't you wish God would give you explicit instructions like he gave Joshua? Or does he? When we seek his will through the scriptures, he does direct our path. Maybe it isn't as clear or explicit as he told Joshua, but we can find the answers. In chapters 14 to 21, the writer describes the distribution of the promised land to the 10 tribes and the 2 tribes of Joseph, Manasseh and Ephraim. The Levites were not given land, but were given the right to live in the cities with some pasture land in the suburbs for their livestock. They also received the meat from the temple offerings. Caleb received a special parcel because of his obedience to God. When Moses sent the spies into the promised land, and he and Joshua came back recommending that they move forward to take the land 40 years earlier. Many of the territories and cities listed still carry the same names today. The covenant that God made with Abraham was an everlasting covenant. It was not dependent on the Israelites being obedient to God or them accepting Christ as the Messiah at the time of his coming. The political leaders of the world today need to read the Bible to see exactly what land Israel is entitled to own. What happened this past week in the UN with the U.S. taking a stand against Israel by not voting will bring some sort of judgment on the U.S., I'm afraid. What were your thoughts as you watched that on TV? What can we do as U.S. citizens to show our support for Israel even when our government turns its back on them? God clearly says that those who bless Israel will be blessed, and those who curse Israel will be cursed. That has not changed, nor has the covenant made with Abraham for possession of the land changed. What we can do, we can pray for Israel and pray they will come to know the Messiah. We can stand up for Israel when many, even members of Christian denomination churches, say God is finished with Israel and the covenant is no longer valid because they rejected Christ when he came to earth. I'm just praying that our new administration truly will support Israel. Shiloh was an ancient city in Samaria, and that is where the first tabernacle was established, where the Ark of the Covenant was placed until the time of Samuel, and eventually when the temple was built in Jerusalem. Joshua and the high priest Eleazar divided the land and designated the cities for the Levites at the tabernacle in Shiloh. There were 48 cities designated for the Levites. They also named 6 cities of refuge where someone who killed someone unintentionally could flee and be protected until they came before the congregation for judgment, or I guess for a trial. This avoided them being killed by family members avenging the death of their relative. All the descendants of Abraham living in that day received the inheritance that God had promised. They defeated their enemies in order to possess the land just as God had promised. Now we come to the focus of our lesson today, which is chapter 22. If you will, read with me Joshua 22, verses 1 through 8. Then Joshua called the Reubenites, the Gadites, and half the tribe of Manasseh, and said to them, You have kept all that Moses, the servant of the Lord, commanded you, and you have obeyed my voice in all that I commanded you. You have not left your brethren these many days up to this day, but have kept the charge of the commandment of the Lord your God. And now the Lord your God has given rest to your brethren, as he promised them. Now therefore return and go to your tents, and to the land of your possession, which Moses the servant of the Lord gave on the other side of the Jordan. But take careful heed to do the commandment and the law which Moses the servant of the Lord commanded you, to love the Lord your God, to walk in all his ways, to keep his commandments, to hold fast to him, and to serve him with all your heart and with all your soul. So Joshua blessed them and sent them away, and they went to their tents. Now to half the tribe of Manasseh Moses had given a possession in Bashan, and to the other half of it Joshua gave a possession among their brethren on this side of the Jordan westward. And indeed, when Joshua sent them away to their tents, he blessed them and spoke to them, saying, Return with much riches to your tents, with very much livestock, with silver, with gold, with bronze, with iron, and with very much clothing. Divide the spoil of your enemies with your brethren. As you recall, the tribes of Reuben, Gad, and half the tribe of Manasseh requested of Moses to settle on the east side of the Jordan River. He had granted their request with the commitment they would go with the other tribes across the Jordan and fight the enemies of Israel so that the other 9.5 tribes could possess their land. It is never explicitly stated in Scripture that it was not God's plan for them to stay on the eastern side of the Jordan, but the promise had been made for the Israelites to possess the land on the western side of the Jordan, all of Canaan proper. The Jordan River would have served as a protective barrier to any invaders. As it turned out, these tribes were the first taken by the Assyrians in 900 BC, so they were more vulnerable to attack. Joshua called these tribes together at Shiloh and told them, based on their obedience and fighting alongside the other tribes to help them conquer the land, they could go home to their families. He distributed much wealth to them from the spoils of war. He also commanded them to remain faithful to God. So what is the lesson in this command Joshua gave these tribes that applies to us today? It seems Joshua's concern was they would fail to be diligent in obeying God once they arrived home with a nation at peace and with much riches. Isn't this a temptation for us today? When things are going well, it's easier to fall away from serving God than when we're in need. When these tribes arrived on the eastern side of the Jordan, they built an altar. When the other tribes heard of this, they wanted to attack them. They believed they were turning their back on the one true God. They feared God would bring judgment on them as well if these tribes had turned away from God. Just in the day of Joshua, we need to be concerned about God bringing judgment on our country when we turn our back on Israel and when we turn our back on God. They sent princes from each tribe to meet with the 2.5 tribes. They told them they thought they had built the altar to turn away from worshiping God. The leaders of the tribes of Reuben, Gad, and half-tribe of Manasseh told them it was not their intention. They had built the altar so that their children would know they must worship the one true God, and the children of the other tribes would know, even though they were separated by the Jordan, they still served and were obedient to the same God. They built the altar as a reminder to themselves to remain obedient to God and to worship only Him. Because of the distance from Shiloh, where the tabernacle was located, they didn't want to lose touch with their spiritual roots. They were not planning to offer burnt offerings there because that would have been against the law. The representatives returned and reported back that the 2.5 tribes had not turned their back on God. I think a lesson here is that Christians can have misunderstandings, but because of the grace God grants, we can come to an understanding without hard feelings, or in this case, even violence.